When I first began researching the old train stations of the late 1800s, I expected the usual story. Steam engines, iron wheels, soot-covered platforms, grimy men shoveling coal into roaring furnaces. The typical industrial image we've been fed since childhood. But that illusion collapsed in the first week, because the train stations I found didn't just look old, they looked impossible, not industrial, not primitive, not invented in 1868 by some Victorian engineer. No, they looked celestial, grand arches that rose like ribs of ancient temples, endless glass domes that gathered sunlight the way old cathedrals gather prayer. Ironwork so delicate and intricate it looked less like machinery and more like lace forged from starlight. These stations felt alive, breathing with symmetry, geometry, and harmony. And the strangest part? None of them felt built. They felt inherited. The deeper I went, the more unnerving the pattern became. Blueprints missing, origins vague, construction records suspiciously repetitive, as if copied from one country to another. Same phrases, same explanations, same excuses. They were built with steam age innovation. They represent the rise of the Industrial Revolution. The glass and iron style was simply architectural fashion. But nothing, not one official explanation, addressed the real question. How did they build these? Not why, not when, not under which architect. No, how? How do you construct a building the size of a cathedral, filled with steel arches perfectly curved, iron ribs flawlessly balanced, and foundations so deep they disappear into the dark, using nothing but steam, horses, and hand tools? Because by the official timeline, these stations were built when workers didn't even have electric drills. They didn't have motorized cranes. They didn't have laser levels or cutting machines. And yet somehow, they produced buildings we still can't replicate today. Buildings that look like they came from another world, another era, another civilization. I kept digging. I went through newspapers, engineering journals, World Fair catalogues, and dusty museum archives that might as well have been untouched for 100 years. And that's when the story changed. Because beneath the beauty and architecture, beneath the glass and iron, there was something else, something mechanical, something hidden, something no one talks about. Water, not as decoration, not as fountains for visitors, a system, a network, a forgotten technology. Everywhere I looked, London, Paris, St. Louis, Antwerp, I saw it. Massive underground vaults, flood tunnels that never flooded, sub-basements arranged like hydraulic chambers, pipes bigger than modern sewage mains, channels leading from rivers straight into the foundations of the stations. And this wasn't random. This was engineered. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. These stations weren't just architectural wonders. They looked like machines powered by water, hydraulic lifts capable of raising entire rail cars, turntables spinning silently using pressure, not steam, vast reservoirs hidden beneath platforms, tanks, channels, valves, and sluices, all perfectly aligned to move water, store water, and convert water into energy. It was as if these stations were part of a global system, a system we've been taught never existed, a system we've forgotten how to see. And the strangest part, the records that describe these systems simply stop. There are engineering journals from the 1860s describing water pressure tests, siphon systems, atmospheric propulsion. And then, after 1890, nothing. No continuation, no improvements, no explanations. It's like someone closed the book halfway through the story and pretended the last chapters were never written. I realized something was wrong when I noticed the same detail repeated again and again in early photographs. No soot, no smoke, no blackened ceilings, no grime. For a world supposedly choking on coal, these stations looked too clean, too pristine, too bright. And the trains themselves, the early engines, in many photos, they barely show exhaust at all. It looked wrong. It looked like something else was powering them, something much cleaner, much quieter, something we no longer understand. That realization shook me, because if the stations were using water power, if they were part of some forgotten hydraulic network, then our image of the Industrial Revolution is incomplete. Very incomplete. Ask yourself, why did every major city build their stations beside rivers? Why do so many stations have enormous fountains outside? Fountains built at the exact same time as the station. Why were underground channels sealed off in the early 1900s? Why are the original engineering drawings missing? Why did the so-called pioneers of these projects disappear from the record? Were they covering something up, or inheriting something they didn't fully understand? And that's when I realized this wasn't just architecture. This was Tartaria, or at least the echoes of something like it. A civilization that used water, geometry, pressure, resonance and design as one integrated system. A system that created beautiful structures that were also functional machines. Not engines we fuel, but structures that fuel themselves. Imagine that. A world where trains didn't burn coal. They rode on water pressure. Where stations weren't buildings. They were energy converters. Where architecture wasn't decoration. It was physics. And the moment that thought entered my mind, I realized I couldn't unsee it. The old stations didn't just look different from modern ones. They looked superior, cleaner, greater, more advanced. As if we didn't invent anything at all, we simply downgraded. And maybe that's the part of history we're never told. Maybe the world before us was far more advanced, not with microchips or rockets, but with a kind of natural engineering that harmonized with the world instead of fighting it. As we go deeper into this story, I'll show you the blueprints, the tunnels, the sub-basements, the sealed chambers, and the engineering manuals that somehow went missing right when they started revealing too much. But first, before we go further, if you're still here, if you're feeling that same spark I felt when I started this journey, do me one quick favor. Hit the like button right now. Not for the algorithm, but because it tells me you're one of the few people who actually wants the truth. One of the few who sees what's hidden between the lines. And trust me, the next parts of this documentary, they're going to change the way you look at history forever. Because we're just getting started, and once you see what's coming, you won't look at a train station the same way again. When I finally understood that these old train stations were far more than industrial buildings, everything I thought I knew about the 1800s fell apart. Because the more I compared the surviving evidence, the more I realized something shocking. These stations weren't designed like new technology. They were designed like something rediscovered. Every angle, every beam, every vault, every arch, it all felt inherited, as if the builders were following blueprints older than the nations funding them. And that's where this story becomes truly unbelievable. When you look closely at stations like St. Pancras in London, Gare du Nord in Paris, or Antwerp Central in Belgium, you begin to notice a strange pattern. The architects credited with designing these stations didn't actually design the most complicated parts. They designed the outer look, the decoration, the facades, the ornamental details. But the structural core, the engineering heart of the buildings, is barely documented at all. It's almost as if they were decorating a machine, not building one. Take the platforms, for example. Modern reconstructions show them as flat, simple, almost industrial spaces. But look at photographs from the 1860s and 1870s. Those early platforms were perfectly symmetrical. They weren't just built for passengers. They were built around something, a system, a mechanism, something that required the floors to be aligned with mathematical precision. Even the domes tell a story. Today, people assume the glass ceilings were simply for daylight, but the shapes themselves, the curvature, the geometry, the ratios, they match patterns found in acoustic chambers, resonance halls, and harmonic amplifiers. And combined with the hydraulic channels running beneath them, a different picture begins to take shape. These stations weren't just beautiful, they were tuned to something, to energy, to pressure, to water flow, to vibration. We may never know for sure, but when multiple stations across different countries share the same silent geometry, it is impossible to dismiss it as coincidence. And then there's the water. You cannot study these buildings without noticing the obsession with fountains, reservoirs, and artificial lakes. Every major station of that era had one, always positioned at the entrance, always symmetrical, always connected to hidden channels. Today, these are dismissed as decorative landscaping. But if they were decorative, why were they connected to pressure gates? Why were they connected to metal pipes thick enough to power machinery? Why did they feed directly beneath the platforms? The official narrative claims these systems were for fire prevention. Really? Then why do the channels run far deeper than fire systems require? Why do they connect to substructures no longer accessible? Why were many sealed, paved over, or filled with concrete after the turn of the 20th century? The harder you look, the more it appears that water wasn't just part of the station. Water was the station. It powered the lifts. It powered the turntables. It powered the early switching mechanisms. And it may have done more. In fact, some newspapers from the 1870s even describe trains moving with silent acceleration or mysterious air pressure, as if steam played only a small part in the propulsion. There are accounts of engines that produce no smoke, no soot, no fumes. Engines that seem to glide, not grind. And yet, every reference to these machines disappears after 1890, not replaced, not built upon, simply gone. Why? Why erase a clean, efficient transportation system and replace it with a technology that polluted entire cities? Why remove the hydraulic machinery? Why seal the channels? Why bury the reservoirs? Why downgrade buildings that functioned beautifully into something far more primitive? When I looked into the archives, into the old sketches, into the early engineering papers, the silence was deafening. There were references to atmospheric propulsion, tubular pressure systems, hydraulic impulse movement. Yet none of these systems appear in modern textbooks. It is as if they were deliberately erased. But here is the strangest part. The farther you dig into these stations, the more you realize something deeply unsettling. The architecture is too perfect for the time period. Too precise, too aligned, too mathematically consistent. Every dome follows the same harmonic ratios found in ancient structures. Every arch aligns with cardinal directions. Every station connects to waterways, even when that required massive earthworks. It's as if the Victorians were following instructions they didn't fully understand, as if the machines they installed were simply placeholders, as if the buildings existed before the trains themselves. And when you step back, when you see the pattern, when you compare the stations side by side, the conclusion becomes hard to ignore. These weren't just stations, they were nodes, parts of a larger system. A system of energy, a system of flow, a system of movement, maybe even a system inherited from the civilization we now call Tartaria. Which raises the biggest question of all. If the transportation systems of the 1800s were cleaner, smarter, and more advanced than what came after, then what else have we inherited without understanding? What else has been erased? And how much of our modern world is built on the ruins of a forgotten one? Because when you take away the soot, the steam, and the Victorian myth-making, the stations that remain look less like the start of the industrial age, and more like the end of something much older. In this next episode, we explore how an entire era of clean, silent, water-powered transportation was wiped from history, replaced almost overnight by smoke, soot, and the heavy machinery of the industrial age. What really happened to the technology that once powered the grand stations of the old world? And why did it disappear so suddenly? Let's uncover what the history books won't. When you study these old train stations long enough, something becomes impossible to ignore. They didn't fade out slowly. They didn't decline. They didn't get replaced naturally over time. The water-powered systems, the hydraulic engines, the subterranean channels, they all vanished almost instantly, as if someone flipped a switch on history. And the strangest part, no one talks about it. Not textbooks, not documentaries, not railway historians. It's as though the world woke up one morning and collectively agreed to forget that the most advanced transportation grid ever built had existed at all. Look at the timeline. In the 1860s and 1870s, water-powered stations were everywhere. London, Paris, Brussels, New York. Blueprints show pressurized channels, hydraulic lifts, underground reservoirs, all fully functional. Then, suddenly, by the early 1900s, the narrative changes. Everything becomes steam. Everything becomes coal. Everything becomes smoke. No explanation, no transition, just silence. You would think there would be debate, newspaper articles arguing for water versus steam, engineers publishing essays about efficiency comparisons, city planners fighting over budgets. But there is none of that. There is no transition period in the historical record. One decade the stations are clean, bright, polished, harmonious. The next decade they are soot black, retrofitted, and stripped of their elegance. Something happened. Something big enough to erase a functioning energy system. Something powerful enough to rewrite the story so thoroughly that modern historians no longer even question it. You can see the moment it happened in the photographs. The change is not gradual, it is brutal. Stations that once glowed with reflective glass domes are suddenly covered in metal plating. Arches that once resonated with sound and pressure are bricked up. Hydraulic channels that once connected entire neighborhoods are filled with rubble and concrete. Even the fountains disappear. The grand water systems, the ones right in front of the stations, the ones early photographs show feeding channels beneath the city, they're all redesigned into tiny decorative puddles or removed entirely. Almost as if someone wanted to erase all evidence that water ever played a role. At the same time, steam becomes the hero of the century. Every newspaper praises it. Every exhibition glorifies it. Every government funds it. And all the while, The hydraulic systems, clean, silent, endlessly renewable, are quietly dismantled. Why would anyone abandon a system that required no coal, no noise, no pollution, and barely any maintenance, unless that system didn't belong to them? The idea becomes unsettling the deeper you go. Maybe the Victorians didn't invent the stations. Maybe they inherited them. Maybe they were caretakers of a technology they barely understood. And when new powers emerged, industrialists, governments, corporations, those systems became a threat. A water-powered city can't be taxed the same way. It can't be controlled the same way. It doesn't require constant fuel, constant purchase, constant supply chains. A free-flowing energy grid is the nightmare of every empire. So the story begins to shift. Historians claim the stations were always steam-based. Engineers start modernizing structures that were never theirs to begin with. And photographs of men chiseling away the original stone arches become normalized as renovation instead of destruction. There's a moment around 1905 where the photography tells the truth. You see workers ripping out enormous valves far too large for any steam system. You see channels being filled with cement. You see turntables abandoned. You see water tunnels being sealed with iron plates. And then, suddenly, the doors to those areas are locked forever. No public tours, no documentation, no explanation. The more you examine the evidence, the more it feels like someone wasn't modernizing the stations. They were weakening them, downgrading them, making them match the narrative that steam was the peak of 19th century progress. But the visual evidence contradicts that story completely. The earlier stations worked better. They were cleaner, they were quieter, they were more advanced, and then they were gone. Not broken, not replaced, erased. It's the single biggest historical red flag. When an entire technology disappears without debate, without transition, and without explanation, it means the disappearance wasn't natural. It was engineered. And once you understand that, the history of the 19th century stops looking like progress and starts looking like a cover-up.